Alright, people. This is exactly why I have so much love for this man. For his mind. For the way his brain works. And for his will. And his strength to do what I see as whatever it takes to do something, to try to make sense of everything and anything that goes on in life. I see that characteristic in him, which is the same one I seen in my grandfather, which is the same one I see in Joe Rogan, which is the same one I see in Patrick Bet-David, which is the same one I see in myself, and many other great people that I was blessed enough to cross in my life, somehow, in some way. So I'm going to share a little bit of what he has to say, and I'm going to hope and pray that everybody is willing to take the time out of their life, out of their day, instead of doing what they've been doing for however long and for whatever reason in their lives, to just take this moment and go to his page and watch it. This little bit of time out of your life. Because, like I said earlier today, today's voices are tomorrow's statues. And I didn't coin that. Take Naps did. Who is another one. Take Naps. Bobby Sauce on Instagram. He said it in his Gettysburg Address. Today's content, today's voices, is tomorrow's statues. So here we go.
Hello, everyone. I've begun to consider using my YouTube channel and podcast for material generated by people other than myself. I recently put up a lecture by Jonathan Pajot that was delivered to the Jung Society in Montreal. I thought it was particularly brilliant. Discussion of the underlying narrative structure and conceptual structure of Genesis. Added that to the sequence of my videos on Genesis. My wife is going to be releasing a series of interviews with Jonathan Pajot as part of her investigation into the nature of the divine feminine. So that's coming up soon. And in this instance, I asked my friend and colleague, psychiatrist Dr. Neumann Deutsch, to read an essay he wrote a few weeks ago called Needle Points, which is the most penetrating analysis that I've read about the COVID policies that have bedeviled and helped us over the last few years. Dr. Deutsch is a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst and a solid scientist, renowned for his writing on science and the brain, and in my opinion, Canada's most literate physician writer. He's also a friend and colleague of mine. He wrote the introduction to 12 Rules of Life. His essay, Needle Points, which he's reading today, first appeared a few weeks ago in Tablet magazine, but it's perhaps even more relevant today. Like me, Dr. Deutsch is vaccinated. He describes the history of vaccines, praises what he calls the kernel insight, and makes a solid and intelligent case for the utility of the technology. Then he details the COVID state of mind, describes the working and nature of the brain circuits triggered by contagion, and helps explain why the issue of vaccination is tearing families, friendships, professions, and even states apart. He describes why debates about vaccination and infection policies are always emotionally radioactive on both sides of the debate, showing us why our reason is threatened during contagion, detailing why we are then tempted to treat each other so badly. He explains why those who hesitate in the face of the current policies surrounding vaccination have concerns more justified by history and experience than they are often credited with, particularly when their views are caricatured and demonized. He makes the case that the best path through the current crisis is not through coercion, that such coercion is in fact a reliable indicator of failed government communication and policy. Dr. Deutsch describes the alternative participatory model in which humane physicians speak to patients respectfully and as individuals with their own agency, and explains that those who adopt this approach do much better public health work, as would governments if they wished to enhance instead of degrade trust in public health. I've now shared this article with conservatives and liberals alike in Canada, and Democrats and Republicans in the US, many of them, all who have received it and read it in this polarized time, have expressed their appreciation for its content and its writer. Dr. Norman Deutsch did his homework, as he always does. He's the author of The Brain That Changes Itself and is currently a contributing writer for Tablet magazine, where this article is published and where all the links to the scientific references he quotes can be found. He's also executive director of Health and the Greater Good, a new think tank devoted to finding solutions to health problems that respect civil liberties, so that neither health nor civil liberties need needlessly be at the expense of the other. I wanted to bring this article to the broadest public attention possible, given its importance, and felt that having Dr. Deutsch read it so that people could watch it and listen to it on YouTube and in podcasts, was assuming that would be the most effective way to disseminate the information. So, without further ado, Dr. Norman Deutsch and needle points.
Needle points. Why so many are hesitant to get the COVID vaccines and what we can do about it. By Norman Deutsch, read by the author. October 27th, 2021. Since my days in medical school, I've had a fascination with the kernel insight behind vaccination. That one could successfully expose a person to an attenuated version of a microbe that would prepare and protect them for a potentially lethal encounter with the actual microbe. I marveled at how it tutors an immune system that, like the brain, has memory and a kind of intelligence, and even something akin to foresight. But I loved it for a broader reason too. At times, modern science and modern medicine seem based on a fantasy that imagines the role of medicine is to conquer nature, as though we can wage a war against all microbes with antimicrobials to create a world where we will no longer suffer from infectious disease. Vaccination is not based on that sterile vision, but its opposite. It works with our educable immune system, which evolved millions of years ago, to deal with the fact that we must always coexist with microbes. It helps us to use our own resources to protect ourselves. Doing so is in accord with the essential insight of Hippocrates, who understood that the major part of healing comes from within, that it is best to work with nature and not against it. And yet, ever since they were made available, vaccines have been controversial, and it has almost always been difficult to have a non-emotionally charged discussion about them. One reason is that in humans and other animals, any infection can trigger an archaic brain circuit in most of us called the behavioral immune system, or BIS. It's a circuit that's triggered when we sense we may be near a potential carrier of disease, causing disgust, fear, and avoidance. It's involuntary and not easy to shut off once it's been turned on. The behavioral immune system is best understood in contrast to the regular immune system. The regular immune system consists of antibodies and T cells and so on, and it evolved to protect us once a problematic microbe gets inside us. The BIS is different. It evolved to prevent us from getting infected in the first place by making us hypersensitive to hygiene, hints of disease in other people, even signs that they are from another tribe, since in ancient times, encounters with different tribes could wipe out one's own tribe with an infectious disease they carried. Often the foreign tribe had its own long history of exposure to pathogens, some of which it still carried, but to which it had developed immunity in some way. Members of the tribe were themselves healthy, but dangerous to others. And so, we developed a system whereby anything or anyone that seems like it might bear significant illness can trigger an ancient brain circuit of fear, disgust, and avoidance. It can also trigger rage, but rage is complex because it's normally expressed by getting close to the object and attacking it. But with contagion, one fears getting too close. So generally, the anger is expressed by isolating the plague bearer. The BIS is thus an alarm system specific to contagion, and I should add, to the fear of being poisoned, which, before the development of modern chemistry, often came from exposure to living things and their dangerous byproducts such as venoms. Thus, it can also be triggered by non-animate things like body fluids of some kinds, surfaces others may have touched, or even more abstract ideas like going to the grocery store during COVID. There is one exception. The BIS doesn't get or stay activated in people who don't feel vulnerable, perhaps because they have good personal protective equipment, or because youth gives them strong innate immunity, or because they know they're already immune, or because they're seriously misled or delusional about the reality of the disease. For everyone else, though, what might trigger the system is rather plastic. But once triggered, the system is involuntary. The BIS is, I would argue, one of the instinctual reactions that missed appearing in medical textbooks, perhaps because we've not had a pandemic on this scale for 100 years. Because it focuses on potential bearers of disease, the BIS triggers many false alarms, since an infected person may at first show only the mildest and non-specific symptoms, such as a cough or sniffle, before they become deathly ill. That's why even a small exhalation or a surface touched by a stranger could trigger the BIS. Were it a medical test of danger, we would say the system tends to err on the false positive side. We see it firing every day now, when someone drives alone wearing a mask, or goes for a walk by themselves in an empty forest, masked, or when someone, say with good health and no previous known adverse reactions to vaccines, hears that a vaccine can in 1 in 500,000 cases cause death, but can't take any comfort that they have a 99.999% chance of it not happening because it potentially can. Before advanced brain areas are turned on and probabilities are factored in, the BIS is off and running. One of the reasons our discussions of vaccination are so emotionally radioactive, inconsistent, and harsh is that the BIS is turned on in people on both sides of the debate. Those who favor vaccination are focused on the danger of the virus, and that triggers their system. Those who don't are focused on the fact that vaccines inject into them a virus or a virus surrogate or even a chemical they think may be poisonous, and that turns on their system. Thus, both sides are firing alarms, including many false positive alarms, that put them in a state of panic, fear, loathing, and disgust of the other. And now these two sides of the vaccination debate are tearing America apart at many levels: families, friendships, states and the federal government. It's even affecting the country's ability to deal with the pandemic, splitting hospital staffs and sundering relationships between the scientists studying it. As of this writing, in the United States, about 85% of people over 65, the age group most at risk, are fully vaccinated against COVID, more if you include those who had one shot. 57% of the overall population is fully vaccinated. But around June, the rate of vaccination slowed drastically, down to less than 1 million a day from 3.4 million daily in April. Even though many more people, age 12 and up, were now eligible. 5 million people who got the first shot had not gone to their follow-up appointment. States started sending vaccines back, while some vaccination sites were empty. In response, U.S. public health officials appeared to believe that the number of people who would voluntarily take the vaccine had reached a ceiling. The change could be seen from the top of the messaging system, with President Joe Biden switching from persuasion to coercion of the armed services, federal employees, and, as of September 9th, of everyone working for companies with 100 employees or more, a category that includes about 100 million Americans. In a way, this should be the least likely time in history for vaccine hesitancy. For years, vaccinologists explained vaccine skepticism by noticing that it largely existed because few had lived through a large-scale pandemic, and because vaccines had already eradicated so many serious diseases that it gave rise to complacency about the threat. But today's vaccine hesitancy is happening in the midst of a pandemic in which over 700,000 Americans have died. And a recent Rasmussen poll found that a staggering 1/3 of Americans, quote, believe officials are lying about vaccine safety, close quote. It seems to me especially vital that we broaden our understanding of the history and current state of vaccines, because over the summer, many who chose vaccination for themselves concluded that it is acceptable to mandate vaccines for others, including those who are reluctant to get them. That majority entered a state of crystallization, a term I borrow from the French novelist Stendhal, who applied it to the moment when a person falls in love. Feelings that may have been fluid become solid, clear, and absolute, leading to all or nothing thinking, such that even the beloved's blemishes become signs of their perfection. Crystallization, as I'm using it here, happens within a group that has been involved in a major dispute. For a while, there's an awareness that some disagreement is in play, and people are free to have different opinions. But at a certain point, often hard to predict and impossible to measure because it is happening in the wider culture and not necessarily at the ballot box, both sides of the dispute become aware that within this mass of human beings, there's now a winner. One might say that a consensus arises, that there is now a majority consensus. Suddenly, certain ideas and actions must be applauded, voiced, obeyed, and acted on, while others are off limits. One person who understood how this works intuitively was Alexi De Tocqueville. In Democracies, as long as there is not yet a majority opinion, a range of views can be expressed, and it appears that there is a great, quote, liberty of opinion, close quote, to use his phrase. But once a majority opinion forms, it acquires a sudden social power, and it brings with it pressure to end dissent. A powerful new kind of censorship and coercion begins in everyday life, at work, school, choir, church, hospitals, in all institutions, as the majority turns on the minority, demanding it comply. Tocqueville, like James Madison, was concerned about this tyranny of the majority, which he saw as the Achilles heel of democracy. It isn't only because divisiveness created a minority faction steeped in lingering resentment. It's also because minorities can sometimes be more right than majorities. Indeed, emerging ideas are, by definition, minority ideas to start with. The majority overtaking the minority could mean stamping out thoughts and actions that would otherwise generate progress and forward movement. It's a fascinating moment when this sort of crystallization happens in a mass culture like America's, because seemingly overnight, even the definition of legitimate speech or thought or action also changes. Tocqueville observed that quite abruptly, a person can no longer express opinions or raise questions that only days before were acceptable, even though no facts of the matter have changed. At an individual level, people who were within the bounds can be surprised to find themselves, quote, tormented by the slights and persecutions of daily obloquy, close quote. Once this occurs, he wrote, quote, your fellow creatures will shun you like an impure being, and those who are most persuaded of your innocence will abandon you too, lest they should be shunned in their turn, close quote. In the midst of a pandemic, seeing the unvaccinated as impure is no surprise because, of course, they could carry contagion. But as Tocqueville pointed out, this also occurs when there is no contagion, and we begin to experience those who are on the wrong side as impure, as in failing the purity test, and react to them as though they are dangerous. That we do this even when there is no pandemic, suggests that there is, along with the realistic fear of infection, something else going on here. A sense that those with whom we may disagree are impurities in the body politic, bad people who need to be taught a lesson, even punished. A June 2021 Gallup poll found that among the vaccinated, 53% now worry most about those choosing not to get vaccinated. Quote, surpassing concerns about lack of social distancing in their area, 27%, availability of local hospital resources and supplies, 11%, and availability of coronavirus tests in their area, 5%, close quote. True to the behavioral immune system's impulses, this fear is metastasizing into disgust, even hatred, of those who, because they believe or act differently, are now perceived as threats. On August 26, in a front-page story in the Toronto Star, my local newspaper, a resident was quoted as saying, quote, I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated. Let them die, close quote. In the midst of such a death wish for fellow human beings, even the person quoted understood that an important mental capacity has been lost, empathy, or the ability to model other people's minds. When we lose that en masse, the results can be tragic, not least because getting through this must be a group effort. As I understand it, there are two main approaches to public health in liberal democracies, and both have been tried historically in different places. One begins voluntarily, out of respect for civil liberties, but switches to coercion when some voluntary ceiling deemed insufficient is reached. Ideally, this intervention is based on the principle of least necessary coercion. The benefit to this is that it may work to get more people vaccinated in shorter order. But it also conveys that the government does not trust its citizens to make good decisions on their own, a condescension that in turn, this is human nature 101, eventually generates resentment, even revolt, and the disengagement of significant segments of the population. The other approach, participatory public health, sees the need for coercion as a sign that something in the public health outreach itself has failed. If a ceiling is reached, society's leaders should not simply resort to force, but rather confront the flaws in their own leadership, that they should double down on their responsibility to generate trust in the public. The goal of participatory public health is not to crush, but to better engage. In that spirit, what follows is an attempt by a physician and neuroscience writer, and someone who got vaccinated early and voluntarily, to understand those who have not made this choice. This essay is not about COVID deniers or anti-vaxxers who oppose vaccines on ideological grounds. Nor is it about the activists or political figures who feed off and benefit from the corrosive discourse around vaccines. It is instead about the vaccine hesitant, those who are concerned and anxious about COVID, but also anxious about these new vaccines. These are the people who are not yet vaccinated for reasons that the majority may not understand and which are often more anchored in history and experience than the majority would suspect. They are the Tocquevillian minority that the majority is threatening with job loss and other restrictions. One needn't agree with the decisions or actions of the vaccine hesitant in order to learn something from them and about society as a whole. They pay attention to and are vigilant about different issues than the vaccinated, and have strong feelings about the people and institutions involved in our public health, particularly politicians, the drug regulatory process, and pharmaceutical companies. For many, vaccine hesitancy is not simply about the vaccines. It's about the absence of faith in the wider systems that brought us the vaccines. Quote, "Public health moves at the speed of trust," close quote, notes physician and author Rishi Manchanda. If we want our public health system to function better, safer, swifter, in ways that more effectively safeguard the lives and livelihoods of all citizens, it must be rooted not in coercion, but in confidence, and not only among the majority. Chapter 2, The Kernel Brilliance of Vaccines. The kernel idea.
So I'm going to stop it there. I'm going to scroll up to show you the links where you could go finish watching it, and I encourage you to do so, not just for yourself, not just for education and insight purposes, but for all of us as a whole. Every man, woman, child of every walk of life, human sphere of activity in this entire world. Every single one of us together to be able to grow, educate each other, learn from our mistakes, and be better than we were the day before. And hopefully, everybody could leave this world one day just a little bit better than we found it. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for everything you've been doing. Your courage and your will and unique strength and mind.